It's 40,000 years ago. You wake up, you're hungry. You are always hungry, because that's just the baseline setting for being alive at this point in history. There's no fridge, no pantry, no gas station on the corner selling something vaguely food-shaped in a wrapper. There's just the land around you and whatever it decides to offer today. And here's the thing nobody tells you about ancient humans. They weren't eating some clean, simple, caveman diet fantasy of grilled meat and berries. They were eating things that would make a modern nutritionist faint, things that sound completely insane by today's standards, and things that, honestly, some of us are now paying premium prices to eat again because apparently everything old becomes trendy eventually. So let's talk about what was actually on the ancient menu. Because the real story of what humans ate every single day for hundreds of thousands of years is stranger, weirder, and considerably more disgusting than the highlight reel you usually get. And before we get into the list, let's clear up something important. When people picture ancient eating, they usually picture one narrow slice of it. Some idealized hunter walking out of the forest with a fresh kill over his shoulder, everyone gathering around a fire for a nice clean protein dinner. That image exists because it's the version that survived into modern marketing. It's simple, it's heroic, it sells gym supplements, but it leaves out almost everything that actually kept ancient populations alive for the other 360-something days of the year when nobody happened to bring down a deer. The real diet was built on desperation, opportunism, and a willingness to eat things that would make most of us today gag on sight. Here are 10 foods that ancient humans ate constantly, that we mostly forgot about, ignored, or in some cases got a little too squeamish for. Number 1. Bone marrow. And not as a fancy garnish on a $50 restaurant plate. As a staple. As basically the ancient equivalent of a protein shake. Here's what a lot of people don't realize. Early humans were not always the ones killing the big game. For a huge stretch of our evolutionary history, we were scavengers. We were showing up after the lions and hyenas had already taken the good cuts, the muscle, the organs, all the stuff predators actually want. What was left? Bones. But here's where humans got clever. Big predators can crack open a rib cage, but they generally can't crack open a thick leg bone to get at the fatty marrow inside. Humans could. With a rock. That's it. That's the whole technology. And that marrow turned out to be an absolute calorie bomb, dense in fat, at a time when fat meant survival. Not a thing you avoided on a diet. Some researchers argue this scavenged marrow was one of the reasons our brains got as big as they did, because brains are ridiculously expensive organs to run, and they needed a serious, reliable fuel source. Some archaeological sites in Africa show cut marks and percussion fractures on animal bones dating back well over 2 million years, evidence that this wasn't a rare trick, but a routine, everyday part of survival, repeated so many times that it left a permanent fingerprint in the fossil record. So in a very real sense, you might be reading this sentence right now because your extremely distant ancestors were out there smashing old bones open with rocks to steal the leftovers nobody else wanted. Number 2. Insects. Just casually, constantly. Insects, grasshoppers, termites, beetle larvae, ants, entomophagy, the fancy word for bug eating, wasn't some rare desperation food. In many parts of the ancient world, it was a completely normal, reliable, everyday protein source, sitting right there alongside whatever meat or plants were available. And when you actually look at the numbers, it makes a disturbing amount of sense. Insects are absurdly efficient. High in protein, high in fat, easy to find in large quantities, and unlike hunting a deer. A termite mound doesn't run away from you or try to gore you with antlers. Some archaeological sites even show tools that seem specifically designed for processing insects at scale. Which tells you this wasn't a one-off emergency snack. This was regular grocery shopping. We just did it with our hands and a stick instead of a cart. And before you get too smug about how far removed you are from this, roughly 2 billion people on Earth today still eat insects as a normal part of their diet. The rest of us just got weirdly precious about it somewhere along the way, largely because bugs became associated with poverty and desperation as agriculture spread and livestock became a status symbol, which is a fairly recent cultural shift dressed up as if it were some ancient universal instinct. Number 3. Rotten meat. On purpose. This one tends to make people physically recoil, but stick with it. Some ancient populations, particularly in colder climates like the Arctic, deliberately let meat and fish partially decompose before eating it. Fermented, buried, aged in ways that would set off every alarm bell in a modern kitchen. And this wasn't laziness or bad luck. It was strategy. Fermentation breaks food down in ways that can actually make certain nutrients more available and easier to digest, and in environments where fresh food wasn't guaranteed every single day. A food source that could be preserved for weeks or months through controlled decay was genuinely valuable. Some traditional Arctic foods still made today are essentially direct descendants of this practice. Meat buried and left to ferment for an extended period before being dug up and eaten. It sounds horrifying to a modern palate raised on sell-by dates and refrigeration. But for a huge chunk of human history, a little bit of decay was a feature, not a bug. The trick, of course, was knowing exactly how much decay was survivable and how much would kill you. A line that generations of people learned the hard way, through trial, error, and presumably some genuinely awful nights. Number 4. Cattails. Not the fluffy brown thing you picture at the edge of a pond and completely ignore. An actual, legitimate, calorie-dense staple food. The roots of the cattail plant are packed with starch, similar in some ways to a potato, and they could be dug up, pounded into a rough flour, and eaten in enormous quantities. Some researchers who have studied ancient plant remains have suggested that cattail starch may have been ground and processed tens of thousands of years before farming was even a concept anyone had thought of. Which means somewhere out there, long before anyone planted the first deliberate crop, someone figured out that this unremarkable swamp plant everyone walks past today was basically free bread growing directly out of the mud. And cattails weren't rare or hard to find either, which is exactly why they mattered. A food source only becomes a staple if it shows up reliably. And a plant that grows in thick, predictable, stands along nearly every waterway on the continent is about as reliable as prehistoric grocery shopping gets. Number 5. Organ meat. All of it. Liver, kidneys, brain, lungs, intestines, the works. And not as some obscure delicacy for the adventurous. As the good stuff. As the part of the animal that got eaten first, before the muscle meat that we now consider the default. This is actually one of the more jarring reversals in the whole story of ancient eating. Today, in a lot of modern diets, organ meat is treated as an afterthought at best, or something faintly gross at worst. But nutritionally, organs are stacked with things muscle meat simply doesn't have in the same concentration. Vitamin A, iron, B vitamins, all the dense, hard-to-get micronutrients that would have made the difference between thriving and slowly wasting away in a world with no multivitamin aisle. Hunter-gatherer groups studied by anthropologists have repeatedly shown a strong preference for organs over muscle when both are available, sometimes leaving the actual steak equivalent cuts for scavengers while the humans walked off with the liver. We basically inverted the entire hierarchy of the animal for reasons that have more to do with modern squeamishness than actual nutrition. Some anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have described organs disappearing from the carcass within minutes of a kill, eaten raw on the spot while the muscle meat gets carried back to camp for later. The order of operations tells you everything about what the body actually needed most urgently, and it was never the steak. Number 6. Termite mounds, and specifically the fungus growing inside them. This one is genuinely bizarre. Certain termite species cultivate fungus gardens inside their mounds, essentially farming their own food source underground, and there is evidence that early humans in parts of Africa raided these fungus gardens directly, eating a food that another species had already been farming for millions of years before humans figured out agriculture themselves. Which means, technically, humans may have been stealing agricultural produce long before humans invented agriculture. The termites got there first, farming quietly underground for tens of millions of years with absolutely no recognition for it, and then one day a much bigger, much clumsier species showed up, cracked open the mound, and helped itself to the harvest without so much as a thank you. Number 7. Algae and pond scum. Yes, actual algae, scraped or skimmed from the surface of still water and eaten. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd only do in a survival documentary right before the host apologizes to the camera, but certain types of algae are genuinely nutrient-rich, and evidence suggests coastal and lakeside human populations were eating various forms of algae as a completely normal dietary supplement. Some researchers have gone as far as suggesting that access to algae and other aquatic resources rich in specific fatty acids may have played a role in supporting brain development in early humans living near water. So the slimy green stuff floating on the surface of a pond, the thing your instincts scream at you to avoid, may have quietly been brain food, sitting there the entire time while we walked past it looking for something that looked a little more like an actual meal. Number 8. Wild honey. Hunted at genuine risk to life and limb, not honey in a squeeze bottle shaped like a bear. Honey defended by an enraged swarm of actual bees, in a nest often located somewhere deeply inconvenient, like high in a tree or deep in a rock crevice. And ancient humans went after it anyway, repeatedly, because it was one of the only concentrated sources of pure sugar available in the entire natural world at the time. Cave paintings tens of thousands of years old show people climbing toward beehives, smoke likely being used even then to calm the bees down before the raid. This wasn't a rare treat. In some hunter-gatherer societies studied today, honey makes up a startlingly large portion of total caloric intake during certain seasons, sometimes rivaling meat. Which means somewhere back in deep history, some incredibly brave or incredibly hungry person looked at an angry cloud of stinging insects guarding a tree, climbing with nothing but bare hands and a lit torch of smoking leaves, and thought, worth it. And the honey badger, for what it's worth, had already figured out this trade-off millions of years earlier, which tells you the math genuinely does work out in favor of the stings. Number 9. Clay. Actual dirt, or more specifically, specific mineral-rich clays deliberately eaten. This practice, called geophagy, shows up across multiple ancient cultures and even continues in some populations today. And it wasn't random dirt eating out of desperation or confusion. Certain clays can bind with toxins in the gut, and some researchers have proposed that eating particular types of clay may have helped early humans process certain toxic or bitter wild plants that would otherwise have been dangerous. Essentially, using the clay as a kind of primitive detox filter, letting them safely expand what they could eat. There's also some evidence it may have helped supplement minerals that were otherwise hard to come by. So while eating dirt sounds like the exact opposite of a health strategy, for some ancient populations it may have functioned as one. A way of quietly hacking the food supply to unlock calories that would have otherwise made them sick. It's worth noting this practice hasn't fully disappeared either. Certain pregnant women in various parts of the world today still report cravings for clay or chalk, a strange little echo of a habit that may be far older and far more purposeful than modern medicine originally assumed. Number 10. And this is the one that tends to surprise people the most. Each other's gut bacteria, indirectly, through eating nearly everything raw and unwashed, dirt included, in a way that built an internal microbiome dramatically more diverse than almost anything found in a modern human gut today. This isn't a single food, it's more like the invisible ingredient running underneath every other item on this list. Ancient humans weren't sterilizing their food, weren't washing vegetables under a tap, weren't living in an environment obsessively scrubbed of bacteria the way a lot of the modern world is. And research comparing the gut bacteria of modern hunter-gatherer populations to people living in industrialized societies has found staggering differences, entire families of bacteria present in ancient-style diets that have almost vanished from modern guts. Which raises an uncomfortable question that a lot of researchers are now actually taking seriously. What if some of the rise in modern digestive and immune issues isn't really about what we're eating, but about everything we've stopped accidentally eating along with it? The dirt, the bacteria, the mess. Some scientists studying this have started calling it the biodiversity loss of the human gut, treating it almost like an ecosystem collapse happening quietly inside billions of bodies at once, one hand sanitizer pump at a time. So step back for a second and look at what this list actually adds up to. Bone marrow smashed open with rocks, insects eaten by the handful, meat left to rot on purpose, swamp roots ground into flour, organs eaten before muscle, fungus stolen from termites, algae skimmed off ponds, honey stolen at genuine physical risk, dirt eaten as medicine, and an entire invisible ecosystem of bacteria riding along with all of it. None of this looks anything like the sanitized, simplified version of ancient eating that shows up in a lot of modern diet marketing. The one with the perfectly grilled steak and the artfully arranged handful of berries. The real ancient diet was messier, weirder, more improvisational, and honestly, a lot more resourceful than that. It was built by creatures who could not afford to be picky, who had to extract every available calorie from an environment that was not obligated to hand anything over easily. And here's the part that I think is genuinely worth sitting with. A huge amount of modern food culture. All the labels, all the trends, paleo, ancestral eating, fermented everything, bone broth showing up on menus at $15 a cup, is essentially humanity circling back around to rediscover things our ancestors were doing constantly, out of necessity tens of thousands of years ago. We didn't invent bone broth. We just started charging for it. We didn't discover fermentation as some cutting-edge wellness trend. Arctic populations were doing it while mammoths were still walking around. The idea that ancient eating was simple is almost backwards. It was actually a wildly diverse, constantly adapting, deeply improvisational relationship with an environment that offered calories in the strangest possible packaging, and humans said yes to almost all of it. Because the alternative was starving. And starving was not an acceptable long-term strategy. There's something almost humbling in realizing just how much resourcefulness went into simply not dying every single day for most of human history. No cookbooks, no nutrition labels, no internet telling you what's trending in wellness this month. Just generation after generation quietly figuring out, through trial, error, and occasionally some very unfortunate accidents, what could be eaten, what needed to be treated first, what was worth the risk, and what would kill you. Every single food on this list represents thousands of small decisions made by people who had absolutely no idea they were laying the groundwork for the human diet millennia later. They weren't thinking about brain development, or gut bacteria, or micronutrient density. They were thinking about one thing: getting through today. And in doing exactly that, they accidentally built the entire biological and cultural foundation for how the rest of us would eventually eat. So the next time you're standing in a grocery store, mildly annoyed that there isn't a specific brand of yogurt in stock, or debating which of 6 nearly identical granola bars to buy, it might be worth remembering that somewhere back down the family tree, someone was climbing toward an angry beehive, or smashing open a bone with a rock, or carefully deciding whether that particular root was the kind that would feed them or the kind that would kill them. That instinct hasn't actually gone anywhere. It's just been buried under a few thousand years of convenience. Somewhere deep in the back of your brain, there is still a version of you that would recognize marrow as treasure, that would know exactly which mound to raid for fungus, that would look at a pile of insects and see dinner instead of a nightmare. We like to think of ourselves as having moved on from all of that, as having evolved past it into something cleaner and more refined. But the truth is a little stranger and a little more interesting than that. We didn't leave that resourceful, opportunistic, slightly disgusting ancestor behind. We just started calling their leftovers gourmet. And maybe that's the real punchline hiding underneath this entire list. Every era of humans has looked back at the ones before them and assumed they knew better, assumed they'd finally figured out the clean, correct modern way to eat. And every single time, a few thousand years later, someone digs up a bone, a burial site, or a fossilized gut. And it turns out the ancestors were already doing the thing we just rebranded and put a premium price tag on. Bone marrow became bone broth. Fermented meat became charcuterie. Wild honey became artisanal raw honey with a hand-drawn label. The dirt-eating instinct became probiotic supplements sold in a capsule so nobody has to actually touch soil. We keep reinventing the wheel and calling it innovation, when really we're just slowly, expensively remembering what our ancestors already knew. Out of necessity, for free, tens of thousands of years before any of us showed up. They never branded it or charged admission. They just ate, survived, and passed it down, quietly, until it landed, somewhat ironically, on a menu near you.